seminars that we usually have focus on research results. And in this case, we are going to learn about preprint servers and how they work, I think. We have Richard Sever and Dr. Olaya Fernández Gayol. Thank you both for taking the initiative to give us this seminar, for taking the time of sharing your impressions and the work that you are doing. I think this is a work that benefits all of the scientific community, and it's really a privilege to get from the first hand what it's about. So some of us may be familiar with it, but I think still it's important that we know how the system works. So it's a privilege for me to introduce this seminar. Dr. Richard Sever, he's Assistant Director of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press, and is one of the co-founders of the servers of the bioRxiv and the medRxiv servers. I think that these are the most used and the most well-known repositories of preprints in the biological and medical sciences. He also serves as executive editor of the Cold Spring Harbor Perspective journals and launched the precision medicine journal Cold Spring Harbor Molecular Case Studies. He graduated in biochemistry from Oxford University and obtained his PhD at the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge. And then he moved to the editorial field, and first he worked as editor at Current Opinion in Cell Biology, and then in Trends in Biomedical Sciences. And then he worked as executive editor of the Journal of Cell Science before moving to finally the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in 2008. And in 2022, he was awarded an honorary ESC. This is I assume is a honorary doctoral from Cold Spring Harbor School of Biological Sciences in recognition of his work to promote scientific communication. Well deserved, I think. And we also have Olaya Fernández Gayol. He joined the bioRxiv and the medRxiv team recently in late 2021 as content specialist. Olaya graduated in biology in our university. And then he did the PhD in neuroscience here at the Institute of Neuroscience under the supervision of Juan Hidalgo. And then he joined the laboratory of Laurie Seltzer at Columbia University as postdoctoral researcher, studying molecular characteristics of the amygdala in a mouse model of anorexia nervosa. And I think she has been also interested in she has engaged in different activities besides the research. And she was president of the Columbia University Postdoctoral Society, and she was awarded the Scott Memo Award for Excellence in Service of the Postdoc Community. She has also produced and co-hosted a podcast, Finding Answers, is that right? About doing the postdoc in the US, and she's also involved in the Association Españoles Científicos in the USA. So there she works to promote networking and professional development opportunities for Spanish scientists in the US and Spain. So thank you very much for taking the time, and you can go on with the presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess you can, everyone can see my slides, correct?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. We're delighted to talk with you. It's a long time since I've been in Spain, so it's just a shame that we couldn't be there in person. So, sorry, I'm just getting control of my slides. So I wanted to start off just by making the point that what Olaya and I are going to talk about is an initiative of Cold Spring Harbor Lab. This is not a commercial project. It's not so this is not a pitch from a commercial publisher. We both work at Cold Spring Harbor Lab, which is a non-profit institute in Long Island in New York, which has 600 staff and a long history of research in molecular biology, cancer, neuroscience, genomics, QBio. and plant biology. But we also have an equally long history in scientific communication. Cold Spring Harbor has been running courses for more than 100 years. Something like 8,000 scientists typically come through the lab every year to learn about new techniques and to hear about the latest advances in biomedical sciences. We also have a campus at Suzhou in China for meetings as well. We have a graduate school, residential lab courses, and a DNA learning center that teaches high school kids about genetics. And also we've long been involved with dissemination, publishing a number of books, journals, and most recently launching preprint servers. So we're really familiar with this process, which is essentially the traditional publication process. And the point I want to make here is this is what describes what happens at a typical journal. The author submits a paper to an editor who then reviews the content. If you're lucky, about 50% of the time they'll choose to send it out to referees. This will take several weeks for referees to offer reports. The editor will then look at the paper again. A lot of the time the paper is rejected. If you're lucky, the most likely thing that happens is that the editor asks the author to revise the paper, and so several months will go by, there'll be a resubmission, and then ultimately the paper is accepted and published. But all of this happens before anybody can read the paper. And so the question is really, in the age of the web, should we do it like this? And I think the answer that Olaya and I will give is no. What we should do is post preprints so that we decouple the sharing of the paper from its evaluation by peer review, and that's what we call preprint. So that's what I want to be clear. What we mean by a preprint is a manuscript that is yet to go through the peer review process and get that stamp of authority by a journal. So this is what the process looks like in the preprint world. The first thing you do as an author is post your manuscript on a preprint server, and then you can submit it to a journal for evaluation. Or in some cases, you may choose not to send it to a journal at all. In a small number of cases, that's the choice that people make. And there's obviously a precedent for this. The physicists, computational scientists, and mathematicians have been doing this for years, for 30 years, in fact. arXiv was launched in 1991, initially based at Los Alamos and now at Cornell. It's a non-profit that shares preprints in physics, computational sciences, and a number of related disciplines. And they now have actually close to 2 million preprints. So inspired by arXiv in 2013, we launched bioRxiv, which was intended to complement arXiv and serve as a preprint server for the biological sciences. It's funded by Cold Spring Harbor and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. It's all completely free non-profit service of Cold Spring Harbor. And what was interesting is after we launched bioRxiv in 2013, there followed an explosion of new preprint servers, ChemArchive, SocArchive, AgriArchive, lots of sort of discipline-specific community servers for sharing manuscripts in different areas of science and indeed the humanities. We followed up in 2019 with the launch of medRxiv. This was a collaboration with Yale and BMJ in the UK. medRxiv was intended to complement bioRxiv, the difference being that it covers the clinical area, and there's some other concerns about clinical information. So it has there's more ethical checks that are involved. We have an enhanced screening procedure because obviously there are more concerns about releasing unpeer-reviewed clinical information to the world, particularly things that might affect patient behavior. So why, what are the reasons for posting a preprint? Well, as I said, the main reason is rapid transmission of results. It's also an opportunity to get feedback on your work before it goes to a journal. And there's lots of examples of people putting preprints online, getting feedback that makes the paper better, so it has an easier time when they then go on to send it to a journal. It's important visibility for early career scientists who may not have that many papers and may be treading water for quite a long time, waiting for them to go through peer review. So it's a way that they can show early signs of productivity and make their work immediately available to grant committees, hiring committees, tenure committees, potential employers, that type of thing. So this is just some quantitative data to make this point about accelerating communication. If you look at the blue curve there, that shows the average times from submission to publication in journals that appear in PubMed. And you'll see that the mean there is about 6 or 7 months. So that's the 6 or 7 months before anybody can read the paper, but the range goes out to 2-3 years. And you do hear of people whose papers take 3 or 4 years before they're published. By contrast, if the manuscript is first posted as a preprint, it's typically available for anybody to read within about 48 to 72 hours. And this has a real tangible benefit for individuals. So this is a timeline of a recent study by a former colleague of ours, Mike Fagan, who is now, he was a postdoc at Cold Spring Harbor. He now has his own research group in the north of New York. But he described a recent timeline of a collaboration with another group. So what happened was he was on Twitter and he saw an interesting paper that had been posted on bioRxiv midway through 2017. He immediately reached out to the author and started discussions about the work, which became a formal collaboration. In around August, they started, sort of resource sharing, model development, doing experiments. And by the turn of the year, by January of 2018, they had all these follow-up results. They were harvesting organoids and doing sequence and data analysis from follow-up work based on the paper that he'd read in the middle of June 2017. Now, what's really interesting is that when he got the results from the follow-up work in January of 2018, that was pretty much the same week that the paper that he'd read in June of the previous year was finally published in a journal. So essentially, he had a 7-month head start because the other person had posted the work as a preprint. And, as a young investigator, he has 5 years before he'll be assessed for tenure. And a 7-month head start is a huge benefit. So, he really felt that this massively speeded up his science. And of course, what you want to imagine is the idea that everybody does this. If everybody does this, then everybody's work speeds up. Then actually, Steve Quake at the BioHub in San Francisco has done some mathematical sort of back of envelope type modeling, which suggests that if everybody did this, if everybody releases their work early like this, then you get a rapid improvement in the pace of science. And after 10 years, you ought to be able to speed up science by about 5-fold. So I think that's really the reason for why one should do this. How does it actually work? This is the process that sort of Olaya manages, and this is our workflow. When you submit a paper to bioRxiv, what happens is it undergoes some administrative checks. It's then viewed by a group of affiliates who are all scientifically trained to basically say, to check whether it's appropriate to go on bioRxiv. It's important to stress that this is not peer review. It's just as a course filter to ensure that everything that appears on bioRxiv is science. And a small number of papers are escalated for further discussion. But as I said, the important thing is to distinguish this from peer review. What the screeners are looking for is the paper nonsense? Is it not science? Is it actually a paper? Is it research, or is it just opinion? Might it be plagiarized? Or particularly for medRxiv, could this be dangerous? So a small number of papers are declined based on these criteria. When the article does go online, this is what it looks like. It gets a DOI, so it's a sort of permanent identification and a permanently identifying number so that it can be cited. There's a date stamp on the article, so this can be used for priority. You can say, this is the date that I did this work. The authors get to choose the subject area for the work. Is it biochemistry, cell biology, neuroscience, etc. And the type of article. We want to provide a forum for people to produce negative, confirmatory, conflicting results, so people can define their work as being a new result, or a contradictory result, or a confirmatory result, to encourage a more breadth of reproducibility studies. A big difference with the preprint is that you can submit multiple versions. So if you go to the preprint, there's a history tab that will show you, you will link back to all the older versions and show you when they were posted. There's also an opportunity for authors to provide a revision summary to say what's new about that paper when they revise it, so that readers can make a decision as to whether or not they want to read the paper, the new version of the paper. We also provide metrics because authors are often interested in knowing how frequently the paper has been downloaded, how many people are tweeting about it, has it appeared in news outlets, etc. So that's something called alt metrics. So we provide those for authors for what it's worth. Some people really like this, some people are not so keen, but we provide them because some authors like them. And then, very importantly, once the paper is published in a journal, we make a prominent link so that anybody who comes across the preprint can see, look, this is now published in Nature. I can go and read the final journal peer-reviewed version. So how are we doing? Well, we now have something like 220,000 preprints posted across bioRxiv and medRxiv. There's a fairly consistent figure of about 30% of these papers are revised. So it's interesting to see over the years, this has been very constant. About 30% of people submit revised versions of papers, most just once, but sometimes people will revise them many times. And around 10 million people are looking at bioRxiv and medRxiv every month. And again, a fairly consistent 70% of papers are published in journals. So if you look in a window about 2 years after the papers are published, you find 70% of them are now appearing in peer-reviewed journals. And I think this is an important number for two reasons. One is that a lot of people initially said, oh, well, if you have preprints, it'll just be lots of really bad research that never goes into journals. And that shows that that's not the case. Most of them appear in journals. But it also shows that there's a small number of people who are posting work as preprints that never ends up in a journal, and we can maybe talk about what that means a bit later. Over the period since bioRxiv and medRxiv have been going, we've seen a lot more people posting preprints, obviously, but reading and citing them. Most journals allow people to post preprints. In the early days, people were worried that journals would not allow you to put a preprint on a preprint server, but actually for basic research, it's pretty much all journals allow it now. Lots of funders not only allowing citations of preprints in grants, but encouraging people to use them as evidence of early productivity. You see institutions like Rockefeller University actively telling people who are applying for jobs to include preprints in their applications because it shows their most recent work. And there's some signs that because people have the confidence that they can put the work on a preprint server, it's permanent, they have a date, it encourages them to talk about more recent data at meetings. This is the importance of rapid communication has been very, very evident during the pandemic. When you look back to the SARS outbreak of 2003, the vast majority of papers about SARS were published after the epidemic had ended. And there was an article in PLOS sort of lamenting this in 2018 and pointing out that when we had the Zika outbreak, you began to see papers about Zika appearing on bioRxiv during the outbreak. And then, of course, obviously none of us could have foreseen what was going to happen in 2020 with the pandemic and SARS-CoV-2. And what's amazing is that we've now had 26,000 preprints across medRxiv and bioRxiv on COVID and SARS-CoV-2. And, this is a timeline that Olaya generated recently showing how important it was early on. The first cases of COVID or Wuhan coronavirus, as it was called then, appeared in December of 2019. The virus was recognized by WHO sort of in early January, and we got the first preprints on bioRxiv and medRxiv midway through January, before COVID-19 had even been coined. And then obviously the pandemic was declared by the WHO in March of that year. and it was interesting on medRxiv. You then saw an explosion of COVID research because people realized how quickly this needed to appear. So on bioRxiv and medRxiv, we got the early epidemiological observations coming out of China. There was a wave of submissions describing what was happening in China. There was then a wave from Italy. We then started seeing things from the United States, Britain, and the rest of the world. Very rapidly, the structural biology of the spike protein was posted. Obviously, very important to understand that for things like vaccine development, and more studies as people began to understand the molecular biology of viral infection and the intracellular targets that might be useful for development of therapies. A big So a big paper, a really important paper that came out on medRxiv, of course, was the publication of the recovery trial, showing that dexamethasone was an effective treatment for severe COVID. And that came out, sort of many weeks before it appeared in New England Journal of Medicine. So people have made the point that actually there's people whose lives were saved because of this, because the fact that dexamethasone worked was out there. People were able to look at the trial and say that does work. And subsequently, the recovery trial showing that hydroxychloroquine did not work was posted, which was also very important. After that, we've seen latest information about new viral variants and the efficacy of the vaccines initially and against some of these different variants at different times in different places has been shown by papers that appeared on bioRxiv and medRxiv. And it was interesting to see that this was sort of widely recognized among the community. Anthony Fauci, the former chief medical advisor to the president of the US, noted this, saying, we have this new phenomenon of preprint server. You've got to pay attention to it. Samuel Swaminathan, the chief scientist of the WHO, saying that she welcomed the huge increase in preprints to share evidence, and people beginning to see this. It was really, it was really important during the pandemic to have this means for rapid communication. So I think it's important to say that obviously preprints are really important for rapid communication, but we also see them as a hub that's an enabling technology in the ecosystem. So obviously they're discoverable by things like Google Scholar and Semantic Scholar. They're now in Europe PubMed Central. They're a means to discover new information. As I mentioned before, the existence of the confirmatory results and contradictory results categories mean that people can post studies of reproducibility that often journals are less interested in. And we aggregate all sorts of conversation and discussion of the science around preprints on blogs, Twitter, various preprint discovery sites. There's a commenting section on bioRxiv and medRxiv. And we also want to make life easier for authors and journals by being an enabling technology for them. So we have these two projects called J2B B2J and J2M M2J. And what these do is allow authors to rapidly send a paper from bioRxiv to a journal. So if you submit to bioRxiv, when you're done, there's a page that allows you to select from dozens of journals, and you can just click a button and we'll send the paper to that journal for consideration. And authors like this because it saves them time. Some journals also send papers in the other direction. So for example, if you submit to somewhere like eLife or Genome Research, they will say, would you like to put the paper on bioRxiv right now? It's going to take us some time to peer review it. You can put it on bioRxiv right away. And we call that J2B for bioRxiv, J2M for medRxiv. But authors like this because it saves them time, and nobody likes having to upload the same files over and over again at a journal if you've already put them on the preprint server. The other thing that's interesting about just the very existence of bioRxiv and medRxiv is because they decouple the dissemination of the work from its review, it provides an opportunity for innovation in new forms of peer review. If you want to do peer review now, you don't have to build a journal because the papers are already on bioRxiv. So there's organizations like Peer Community in France, Pre-Review, Review Commons, the eLife Preprint Review Initiative, and Prelight that are essentially variations on peer review services or teaching peer review as pre-review does. Prelights is kind of like it's run by the company of biologists. They publish Journal of Cell Science Development and Journal of Experimental Biology, but they also have this thing called Prelights, which is a bit like a News and Views, but for preprints. And they have young researchers write highlight articles about preprints. So all of this has been enabled by preprints. And it was interesting to see during the pandemic, people started initiatives like this specifically for COVID-19 papers. So Mount Sinai here in New York started a service for rapid peer review of COVID-19 preprints, because they saw all these papers coming out so quickly, and they felt there needed to be analysis of them before journals were able to do it. Similarly, MIT started rapid reviews COVID-19 RRC19, which was essentially a similar initiative. So as I said, we try to aggregate these on bioRxiv. So we have there's a dashboard on bioRxiv. If you look below any article, you will see this group of icons, and that is where we link direct comments on bioRxiv, peer reviews, various community discussion, media, if people have made videos about papers, etc., and Twitter mentions, so that if you're reading a preprint on bioRxiv and you see there are numbers on that dashboard, then that tells you that people are talking about this paper, people are analyzing it, and you can go and read those peer reviews, comments, or community evaluations. The most sort of explicit version of this is what we call transparent review in preprints, where one group of journals actually post the peer reviews of papers they're considering alongside the preprint. So this is a preprint, what I show here. This is a preprint that was posted on bioRxiv and subsequently evaluated by the journal eLife. And what's happened is on the right-hand window here, you can see this is the peer review that is posted by eLife. So it's interesting, though, although this shows up alongside the preprint, this window on the right-hand side is in fact controlled by eLife. This is an eLife peer review that's actually nothing to do with bioRxiv, but we make it available. So if you're reading the paper, you can see that it's been peer reviewed, and you can see the peer reviews from eLife. And I think this is an interesting thing to consider, what this decoupling will enable for the long-term future of publishing. By having a more decoupled ecosystem, then it may allow us to evaluate scientific work better than we have done before. Currently, what happens is a paper goes to a journal, they make a decision based on 2 or 3 people's view, 3 peer reviewers, let's say, and the editor, and they make a sort of binary decision to publish or not publish it. And so that's essentially a single judgment that is made at one point in time, very early in the life cycle of that information. So one of the interesting things to consider about a sort of future decoupled ecosystem for publication is when the paper first appears on bioRxiv, that can just be the start of a series of different evaluations. That a journal may analyze the paper, you may have independent peer review that may take place at the same time or at a different time. You have completely independent comments on the paper. One of the things people have been considering is the idea of automated analyses of papers, or domain experts who look at just one part of the paper. So you could imagine a system where the preprint goes online, and then one group of people go and look at the statistics, and only the statistics. And then the paper gets a badge to say, the statistics are good here, or we've checked some aspect. And this can all be incorporated into a sort of more holistic evaluation of the paper that takes place over time, and ultimately gives a series of trust signals that give readers increasing confidence in the work. So that's really all I have to say before handing over to Olaya to talk specifically how it affects you. But I just want to acknowledge that this takes the work of an awful lot of people. We have Olaya's one of the fantastic team we have in-house at Cold Spring Harbor. We also, as I mentioned, collaborate with Yale and BMJ, and our colleagues Harlan, Joe, Theo, and Claire have been fantastic in sort of working around the clock with us over the years since we launched medRxiv. And then we have, great support from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, collaborations with Google, Hypothesis, and Knowledge Futures Group, and collaborations, as I mentioned, with eLife, EMBO, and publishers like PLOS. And it's all made possible by volunteers from the scientific community who help us screen the papers. And so, there's obviously far too many to mention here, but this is just to give an indication of the number of people who have been helping us since 2013 on bioRxiv and medRxiv. So really, that's all I have from me. I'm going to hand it over to Olaya now.
Thank you, Richard. So that was, oops, share the wrong screen. That's an overview of our procedures. And now I want to talk a little bit about what you in particular can do to get started with this whole thing, and what can we learn from people who are already doing it. So first of all, I would like to sort of open the picture up to the whole world and see who's doing preprints a lot, and that would be the US. It's the #1 sort of scientific output powerhouse. Not surprisingly, they're #1 economy in the world. So they're #1 in total peer-reviewed publications and also preprints. But I want to give a shout out to Spain, which is a little bit ahead of the position that one would expect economy-wise, and it's #11 in peer-reviewed publications as well as in preprints. It's if you look at the actual proportion of what the preprints represent over the total output, is a little lagging versus what the US is doing. So there's definitely room for improvement. But I just wanted to say that for a small country like ours, it's doing pretty well. So who's posting preprints in Spain? Again, another shout out, the university where you guys are at is in the top 5 of institutions or entities in Spain that are posting in bioRxiv and medRxiv, so that's a good start. But now comes the bad news, is that the Instituto de Neurociencias has a great scientific output with almost 1,000 publications that I could find since 2013, but only 20 preprints. So that is a huge opportunity that you guys have to pick up the use of preprints, because there's definitely the scientific output to do this. So what can you do? Let's take a look at what the top entity in Spain, ICREA, which is actually, as you know, not a university, but rather sort of like a seal for scientists. What are they doing maybe to promote the use of preprints to be the top preprint poster? So first of all, they have this statement on their website that actively discourages any evaluator to rely only on journal-based metrics, so the very dreaded journal impact factor. And so they encourage them to look at all research outputs, which would of course include preprint. So that's an active encouragement to use other ways of proving your scientific output. And also on their website, in the scientific contribution list, they include preprints as well. So they're signaling to everyone that looks at their website that this is valuable scientific output that their researchers are producing. So what can you do as individual scientists and also as an institute to promote the use of preprints? First of all, as Richard was saying, just post the preprint as soon as possible. And this can be using our integration with journals, or just using our very simplified submission system that anecdotally from some people who replied to the pre-talk form is great and very straightforward. So it's not a huge deal to do the submission. So just get into the sort of mindset of posting every scientific output that is eventually going to go to a journal or not, because it's definitely not a requirement, to just put it on bioRxiv or medRxiv. Then I would encourage you to also list these preprints in the institutional website. So you already have the formal publication, so maybe having either interspersed or as a separate section where it's clearly labeled that it's a preprint, but just having them publicly visible. Then just if you post it, start citing it in your talks, in posters, in your grants. As Richard said, you get a DOI, which is the unique identifier for your preprint, but you also get a QR code once the preprint is posted, and this is very handy to put in PowerPoint presentations and posters, because people just like scan the code with their phones and they land on your preprint page and they can start commenting right away or tweeting it. And then this is a little bit more for the higher ups, the senior researchers who might be involved in grant review or have access to the secret circles in the ministerio, to start recommending policy modifications so that preprints start to be recognized in all these progress reports or applications for different positions. Because as Richard said, this is becoming more and more common in the US, but it's definitely not the norm in Spain. And there's only one way to change it. It has to become normalized and it has to become a necessity so that the granting agencies know that this is something that people are doing and should be valued. And finally, since this is a very educational institution, and the Instituto de Neurociencias is very involved with the Master's in Neuroscience and the PhD program, I want to highlight the use of preprints as a teaching tool. So as Richard said, we have the transparent reviews available on the site with our partner journals. So I just wanted to highlight how we could use this as a way of tracking the peer review process and sort of opening up something that is usually done in private and by a very small number of people. So in this case, you would have a group of authors that posted their preprint. As we can see here, it was April 2020. So they submit to bioRxiv, then they submit to eLive, and eLive sends us the reviews for version 1. And this is clearly labeled on the review. This pertains to version 1. Then we can see on the article versions side of the page that they went on to revise their preprint not only once but twice. So we hopefully can see that these reviews that they got were implemented into subsequent versions of the preprint. And then we have the link to the final version, so we can then see how the final version of record with all the peer reviews that was accepted by the journal differs or doesn't from the previous versions. And I think this is a great exercise to sort of see all the intermediate steps that in a regular journal you never see. And the other thing is participating yourself in the peer review process and becoming an agent of this also very usually select and mysterious process by, I think, for example, in the masters, there's the scientific communication module that I think would really benefit from having exercises like what I'm showing on the screen, which is a group of students that got together, read the preprint, and as a class exercise wrote a peer review and then posted it publicly on bioRxiv for anyone, and especially the authors, to have access to it. So you're learning how to write peer reviews, and then you can also use this as course credit. But I think it's a great opportunity to get started early with learning how to do peer review. There's a lot of resources in all these initiatives that Richard just mentioned that have trainings and tips. I've linked here to our blog post on commenting, where we link to one of these, but the comment section of bioRxiv is a great way of getting started with writing in a public and civil way about other people's science. So that's the little sort of action points that I wanted to say here. Now we're gonna open it up for questions because I think that's the most interesting part, is hearing from you guys. I have noted the questions in the forum, so if people are shy, we can get started on those, but I would like to open it up, and thank you all for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Richard and Olaya, for the presentation. Yeah, I understand that some people sent in advance some questions to you, and probably you addressed already some of them during the presentations. But of course, if now there is the question session, so if you have questions, probably it's easier if you post them in the chat, and I can read them for you.
In the meantime, I can sort of get started with some of the themes. The first one, which I think kind of nicely ties with what I was just talking about education, is someone asked, how do you write a preprint? Because you guys get a lot of training on like how to write a paper, but they were wondering, how do you write a preprint? The answer is the same way you write a paper, because a preprint is a paper. I don't know if there's maybe some misconception about what preprints are, but it's just a manuscript, like any manuscript that you would like to have published in a peer-reviewed journal. It is complete. Like, one part of the screening process, as Richard was saying, is that we do look at whether the manuscript that is sent is a complete research output. You cannot submit something that has a section that says discussion to be determined. Like, that does not fly. Like, it has to have all the components of a manuscript, ideally something that would be reproducible by someone else. But I would like to emphasize that it is not a half-baked manuscript. It's exactly the same thing that you would send to the journal, with the caveat that you do get the opportunity to add more experiments to it, switch up the language, correct typos, whatever. We can all make a mistake while typing. But the short answer to the question is that you do write it the same way. More stuff. There were some questions about like preprints getting attention while they're on our website, and how maybe journals use that information. I don't know if Richard, since he's sort of like in both worlds, do you want to say something about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think that there's one of the things that happened very early was people realized that journal editors are looking at bioRxiv. So I remember very quickly people would say, oh my God, I put my paper on bioRxiv, and then I got an email from a Nature editor saying the paper's really good, I'd like you to submit it to Nature. So that definitely happens. So there's a fair amount of that. I mean, I think the problem is that not everybody gets asked by Nature to submit their paper, and then there of course everybody I think gets the spam from the predatory journals. So there's a certain amount of kind of like, hey, your paper's great, please send it to this journal that you've never heard of. So there's a sort of spectrum there, but it's definitely the case. And I think it's PLOS Genetics and the Proceedings, the Royal Society. There's some journals who have editors who are dedicated to doing this. But I mean, I think the main thing to be aware of is that so many of these editors are on Twitter, and there's a lot of discussion of these papers on Twitter. So if you post a paper on bioRxiv and people start saying, wow, this is really interesting, then, then there's a good chance that, an editor will contact you. So that definitely happens.
Yeah. Just on that note, all papers get automatically tweeted with the link. So we do see a lot of discussion sort of stemming from that original tweet, and people retweet, and it's like it's a very easy way to start the dissemination as well.
Yeah, and we have, I mean, one thing we didn't really mention is that bioRxiv and medRxiv have a lot of ways of alerting people to new papers. So there's Twitter, but there's also, we have RSS feeds for all the different categories. So you can have RSS feed for cell biology, molecular biology, developmental biology, etc. And search alerts. So a lot of people set up search alerts. So they may say, I don't know, cadherin and cell junctions, and then email me every time there's a paper on bioRxiv that have those words. So there's a lot of ways people can be alerted to that, and obviously there's a lot of word of mouth as well.
Yeah, another feature that we didn't really talk about is the follow-up preprint feature. So every preprint has a little link at the top that says follow this preprint, and then you can sign up for an alert that will tell you every time that preprint has a comment or gets a revision or is eventually published. And this is not only useful for readers that might want to, like, you read a preprint that is like super interesting, and they say it's like, oh, we're working on like some other experiment, and you really want to see the revisions that they do to this paper. But also, as the author of the preprint, this is also good to be alerted when your preprint gets a comment, or to check that the automatic linking that we do for the version of record has actually worked. Because sometimes if there's like variations in the title or whatever, we might not pick up automatically the final link. But you can be alerted to this, and if you see that like it's been 2 weeks since my preprint has been posted and I haven't got the notification that it's now published, maybe then you can reach out to us and just let us know, and then we will link it manually. So there's lots of good ways of following what's happening. We do have a question in the chat. I can't see the full question.
Okay, you can read it and
no, I can't see it. I just
you can see it. Then okay. I thought you had that.
I can see it. I can address it if you want. So the question was, they like the contradictory results category. How's it working out? Have we had many papers, and have the authors of the paper being contradicted responded? So this is, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of talk about this category, but there aren't that many papers. But there are some really big and important papers there. It's very interesting to see. One of the things that is really interesting is how, because bioRxiv, you can post so fast, you see some amazing things where people really contradict work very, very quickly. So I think the most incredible example of this was, some people may remember a paper in PNAS a few years ago where Craig Venter published a paper saying that he could predict what you look like based on your genome sequence. So this paper, there was a lot of stuff, and there was these pictures, here your genome sequence, and then there's a picture of what the person would look like. And what was interesting was that the same day that the article appeared in PNAS, immediately Yaniv Ehrlich, who was a geneticist at the New York Genome Center, rebutted it in the same day on bioRxiv with a contradictory results paper, and he basically showed, using kind of like mathematical genetic analysis, that what Craig Venter's group were doing was they could predict your ethnicity from your genome sequence, and then they would generate basically a rough picture of what anybody of that ethnicity would look like. So it was kind of, that happened the same day. There was another high profile example of, I don't know how many people are familiar with the tardigrade. It's this it's one of the smallest animals that's still, technically a multicellular animal. But there was a paper in PNAS saying that it had a huge amount of horizontal gene transfer. And obviously horizontal gene transfer is something that you see a lot in bacteria, but it's very, very rare in eukaryotes. And there was this paper saying, you know, the tardigrade has a ton of it. And then like literally within about 3 weeks, there was a paper on bioRxiv saying this is it's sequence contamination that you're seeing. It's not horizontal gene transfer. So there's been some examples like that have been very important. I think the problem really is that people often perceive that there's not much credit for them to post contradictory results. It's kind of interesting to me. One of the things that happens when I give talks is people always talk about, or you know, negative results, contradictory results. It's really important. It's something that comes up in bars, and people say, oh, people won't publish them, and it's like, actually there are, you know, you can put them at PLOS One, scientific reports, all these journals are happy to publish them. We have a dedicated section in bioRxiv for them, and we don't see as many as we'd like. And I think that's partly because people feel that for their careers, a contradictory result is not a significant discovery as doing something new. So I think that kind of gets to a whole nother conversation about incentives and how scientific progress is rewarded. But yeah, there definitely are some high profile examples, but it's kind of interesting that there's a small number and they're fairly high profile when people say, you know, there's this thing, this is totally wrong. I've shown it to be totally wrong. And I think in one of those cases, in the PNAS case with the tardigrade, then ultimately the contradictory report that was in bioRxiv was also published in PNAS to show that the earlier one, and I think everybody thinks that's a good thing, but there's some cultural issues there that we hope will change.
Yeah, and I definitely want to emphasize that we do not accept just you're wrong papers. Contradictory result papers need to have new research, new analysis of the data, like new experiments. Like it has to be its own research paper, even though it's rebutting like other people's findings. More things. I would like to have like an extra slide that I think I'm gonna share, because someone, and we didn't really cover this, was asking about the differences between bioRxiv and medRxiv, and I would like to just like quickly sort of talk about what you could send to each one. And I think the Institute in particular is well suited to submit papers to either, because medRxiv is not only for clinical trials, as a lot of people think. It's essentially any human health related research. So there are groups in the Institute that deal with addiction, with motor diseases. If you have any trials, collaborations with hospitals that are doing human research, medRxiv might be the place for you. Of course, bioRxiv has many categories that researchers from this institute could post in, but I would just sort of encourage you to look at medRxiv not only as the place for the medical doctors to post results about their latest clinical trial, but a place where you can both look at research that has human applications, or like sort of we do have studies on medRxiv that have an animal model component and a human component. So if your paper is within that category, I would encourage you to look up the sort of submission requirements for medRxiv, because it might be better suited for that. And if you end up submitting to what we would consider the wrong preprint server, we do have a direct transfer system. So you might get an email saying we're recommending that this is transferred to the other server because of, like, for example, in particular, sending something over from bioRxiv to medRxiv due to the enhanced screening that Richard mentioned, especially when there's human participants and the ethics are more important. So I would just like, yeah, I wanted to highlight that because we're still archive. It's a younger preprint server, so definitely don't refrain from submitting your research to medRxiv if that would be the better place. And also, a lot of people are afraid that oh, if I don't post it on bioRxiv, which is the most famous one, no one will find it. No, our search is cross-server. So from either of the servers, if you go on to the advanced search, you can search across both. So that won't preclude people from finding your study. And medRxiv papers are also automatically tweeted and have all the same features as bioRxiv. So it's more like a brand thing and than a discoverability issue. So don't be afraid of medRxiv. Do we have any more chat? I can keep going with the.
Okay.
So some people were concerned about publishing after posting a preprint. So can I publish? Where can I publish? Will I get scooped? Richard sort of covered it already a little bit. Most reputable international biomedical journals will accept your preprint. You have a DOI, you have a date. Scooping is something that everyone is very concerned about, but then we don't actually see it happening. So there's not many like reports that we get of like, oh, my science was scooped because I posted on bioRxiv. Richard was part of a survey in 2019 that was posted on bioRxiv, and 99.7% of people did not report getting scooped. So I think it's something that people are more scared than it's warranted for. And as he said, like we do have a partnership with over 300 journals that we submit directly to. So for sure, those journals accept preprints, but many others do as well. And also yesterday when I was sort of writing these down, regarding the scooping, I think, I mean, I see two sides to the scooping. Like you can get scooped just because another group, and scoop is probably the wrong word. Like someone can publish before you can publish, but maybe they were already, like the fact that you posted it on bioRxiv is completely unrelated to the fact that they actually got to publish it first. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, and this is I think the most unlikely case, that they saw your research on bioRxiv and then like they have all the resources and managed to just scramble all these experiments together and managed to publish it before you did. I think that, I mean, it would be very unfortunate for the person that did it, but in the words of the founder of arXiv, that is scientific misconduct because they are failing to cite something that was already available. So I think we can learn a thing or two from the physicists. Like the arXiv is very established in the physics and math community. And to them, I mean, I am married to a mathematician, and she always says, it is unthinkable for a mathematician to submit a paper to a journal without having it posted on arXiv first. So I think that should be our goal, just normalizing it. And as Richard was saying, I think the benefits do outweigh the minimal risks that I think are more in people's minds than actual tangible dangers. So
one thing I would just add quickly, Olaya, is it's important to say there's also a risk for not doing it. Right. In that, I mean, if the point about having the date stamp is you show that this is the day I did this. So there's, if people are worried about this, we've seen this even in Cold Spring Harbor with scientists when they figure out that they're in a race with someone, then they want to use bioRxiv, because you don't know how long the journal is going to take. Whereas in bioRxiv, the thing about bioRxiv is it puts the author in control. You submit it to bioRxiv, and within 2 days, it should be online and you have the date. So if you think you're in a race, that's the best time to do it. I remember seeing there was a couple of articles in Science between Feng Zhang and Jennifer Doudna, the big CRISPR thing that appeared in Science the same week. And it was like, oh, well, I wonder who did it first. But Jennifer Doudna had a paper on bioRxiv 6 months before. So I think that's I think that's the other thing you need to think about. The risk of not doing it is if you don't put it on bioRxiv and somebody publishes it in a journal, then everybody's going to think they were first. Whereas if you put it on bioRxiv first, at least you have a date and you can have the argument about that.
Yeah, and I think also this all comes into the normalizing things. More and more journals are now actively posting on their websites that they will not take into consideration for their editorial decisions the fact that something was published in a peer-reviewed journal like very recently, when they're considering something that you submitted to them that is posted on a preprint server. They're like, it's an unfortunate timing event, but that does not affect the scientific merit of your work. And also, just as a scientific advancement thing that we sometimes tend to forget in this sort of like publish or perish mentality, is that replicating things is actually good. So having 2 independent groups carry out independent experiments that show the same thing in slightly different ways is actually what we want to do. So sort of changing the system bit by bit might get us closer to the eventual goal, which is to just advance science and not just our careers, which is a very practical thing, but I think we shouldn't give up on modifying the system so that it's not fighting against us, like actively.
We have a quick question in the chat. It says that bioRxiv preprints are posted on PubMed, and apparently this is a new feature. Is that true? Can you comment on that?
It's complicated. So there's a number of places that will index bioRxiv preprints. So you can find them from Google. Google Scholar is what I would recommend, because they do a very, very good job. There's also a tool called Semantic Scholar as well. So Europe PubMed Central index bioRxiv and medRxiv preprints, but not some other preprint servers. PubMed Central, the US PubMed Central, has a pilot to index ones from NIH funded research. So it's a little bit tricky. You won't find all of them. I think most people, if you want to find them across all the preprint servers, then Google Scholar is the place to go. That may change with PubMed, but it's complicated by the fact that the US government relationship and what Europe is doing. It's all a bit complicated.
Yeah, and PubMed does also have the COVID pilot where they index COVID papers.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a work in progress. But Google Scholar works great. I use it in my daily screening. So we do rely on that as well. And the Google Scholar also merges that, because this was another question. Google Scholar also will merge the citations of the preprint to the version of record. Because again, people are concerned about your same research eventually having 2 DOIs. And so citation-wise, this can be circumvented with the Google Scholar account. We, as Richard said, and I also showed, we do link to the version of record. So when someone lands on the preprint page and it has been published, they can directly click on the link and then go directly to the version of record. As a sort of general recommendation for anyone citing preprints when pre-publication, I would really encourage you to use the follow-up preprint feature that I mentioned, so that you can track the publication of those studies and then update your citation records accordingly once it has been published. And this is sort of like a community responsibility thing for like accurate citation. And it's not hard to do. You should keep your citations updated at all times.
May I ask a question? As Richard mentioned, I think the culture of publishing preprints varies from one area to other. So where the neuroscience field stands in this matter? I mean, I assume that some areas like I think genomics or genetics probably they usually publish more preprints. Where is the neuroscience field standing in this regard?
Neuroscience is actually the biggest. It's very interesting. So one of the things that you see with preprints is that different fields start adopting them at different rates. So one of the things that happened with arXiv was it all started with high energy physicists. And right at the beginning, some people were like, oh, high energy physics is different. This is why they're doing it. But actually, then you found that the high energy physicists did it. Then the condensed matter physicists and the experimental physicists and the mathematicians started doing it. And what we saw was interesting with bioRxiv was we had the same thing. Initially, it was very much people who worked in genomics and some experimental biology. A lot of people who were mathematicians and physicists before, so knew about arXiv, were waiting for bioRxiv. So that happened very early on. But then it was interesting then, and of course there's a lot of computational people who work in neuroscience. Then neuroscience started, and cell biology and developmental biology. And actually now neuroscience is bigger than anything else. I think neuroscience is the biggest category on bioRxiv, and it's overtaken the genomics. So yeah, so that's doing very well. And I think some, you know, and then you find that maybe sort of immunology and sort of physiology, pathology, some of those more traditional subjects, they're a little bit behind, but certainly, yeah, genomics, molecular biology, and neuroscience in particular, a very large proportion of papers on bioRxiv.
And I did. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah. So this is the share of the different subject categories. As Richard was saying, neuroscience is a huge chunk, followed by bioinformatics. So yeah, it's definitely one of the big ones right now.
Great, thanks. Do you have any other questions that you want to address of the ones that were said before?
I think, I mean, that was most of it. One of the questions was also like, who benefits from all this besides the authors with the, like, I'm sharing my science, whatever. I would say that everyone benefits. As Richard also said, like, science can advance faster if we all share our results earlier. So, and as I said, like, the educational sort of opening up the publication process, getting access to those things that are usually private. Open science is an emerging topic now. Like, there are a lot of initiatives of like sharing all your raw data, sharing your code, like being more open about the whole process. I think preprints are a huge part in this, to give people early access to your results and sort of like getting all in that open science mindset. So I would say that everyone benefits.
Yeah, I would echo that. And funnily enough, I was actually having I had a conversation with somebody at a meeting a couple of months ago and he is working on a clinical trial human clinical trial for new COVID treatments. And it was interesting talking with him, and I was asking him about it, and he said, without bioRxiv and medRxiv, it would have been impossible to do what they did, because he said that the information that came out about, you know, the spike structure and the ways to target virus, etc., came out so quickly, was so public. You know, we had the structures appear very, very quickly, etc., all as preprints. And he said that was absolutely essential to get them to a point wherein in 2022, they were already running a clinical trial of a drug that had not been considered as an antiviral, you know, when the virus emerged. So I think that's kind of interesting. As I said, you know, I gave that example of one researcher, and it's when you add all that together, that you imagine you can essentially get a geometric progression that really makes everything move faster.
I have another quick question. To what extent can the paper be modified in further versions? I mean, you can change. Can you change like the title, the conclusions? Can you change everything? Is this somehow supervised, or after the first submission, everyone is free to modify whatever in the paper?
So every author is free to modify their preprint. The revisions are screened again by the screener team. And as long as the study remains the same, you're free to revise as many with sort of with the how do I say it, like with some sort of mindfulness about like there's a person having to screen this, so like if you realize that you have one typo, we would encourage you to wait until you have a more substantial thing to change, but there's essentially an unlimited number of times that you could revise your preprint, with again the only requirement being that the core of the study remains the same. So the scientific question is the same. You might sort of redo all the experiments or like add 50 more experiments, add a new animal model, change the title, change the figures. Something that we see a lot is people adapting the format to a new journal. So you will see sort of formatting changes, but not content changes. Sometimes people say, I have incorporated the peer reviews, the changes due to peer reviews into my new version. We encourage authors to be sort of transparent about the changes in a revision summary that is available for us during screening, but it will also be public for anyone reading the next version to sort of assess what the changes have been and whether it sort of merits a new read. So we do ask people to be sort of transparent about that because it helps everyone. But essentially you can change as much of the science as you think was needed, and we will allow them to go live. They keep the same DOI, so it's not generating new identifiers. As a user, you can choose to cite the specific version. You can indicate after the DOI if it refers to a particular version. This is not required, but it might, like if there's something like super specific about a version that was then changed and that's what you want to reference, you can add version whatever, and there's a direct link to the version. You can append V and then the number to the DOI, and it will take you to the specific version directly. So I think revisions are great, and you should use them so that the percentage gets above 30%.
Great, thanks. We have a question in the chat. It says if a preprint can be commented and or revised by other authors and then modified according to these comments, how is this different from standard peer review?
Well, that's a really, it's an interesting question because, you know, I mean, there isn't really an answer. I mean, because some people will say, exactly, what is the difference? I mean, I think the real difference is that the tangible difference is that when it appears in a peer-reviewed journal, it has the name of a journal. It's almost like you have a certificate. There's a stamp that says it's been accepted. Right? If you post a paper on bioRxiv and then some people comment on it and you respond and you change the paper, then that's fine. Maybe that's how science should be. But then other people will say, well, actually, you know, I don't know. I want somebody else to tell me whether I should trust this. I want a journal to say this is fine. But it's very interesting. One of the things, I don't know if people have seen this, that eLife have done recently, is they've changed their process, and they say they now don't accept or reject papers. They just peer review them. So you put a paper on bioRxiv, and what used to happen was you put it on bioRxiv, eLife would peer review it, and then the peer reviews would be on bioRxiv, and then if they liked the paper, they accepted it, and they also published it in eLife. Now they've changed it completely. Now what happens is you submit it to bioRxiv, eLife peer review it, and then they put the paper and the peer reviews in their journal, and they say we have peer reviewed it. They don't have an acceptance. So I think that it's a very good question, because I think 5 years ago people would say, oh well, there's a big difference. The journal has put its stamp. The journal has accepted the paper. The journal is putting its name behind the science. But of course, that's completely changed with eLife now. So I think this is kind of interesting, and this is one of the things that I was kind of getting to in the end of my part of the talk, is about how it's encouraging evolution. And Olaya and I mentioned that 70% of papers are published in journals, but 30% of them aren't. So it's interesting to see those 30%. Some of them maybe some, for some, I think some people decide that for some research they do, they'll put it on bioRxiv, they'll get some feedback, they'll modify the paper, and that's it. That's all they need to do. Maybe if they feel it's like sort of some incremental work, they will do that. So it's an interesting question, and I think it's a question that lots of people are asking, and the answer will change.
Yep. And this is sort of, oh, sorry. Oh, well, this is sort of related to a question that was in the forum about like how should you address reading a preprint? And I think like you should approach it as you read any scientific paper. I feel like the seal of approval that Richard said from a journal, I think carries a lot more weight than it should for a lot of people, and you can sort of forfeit your scientific judgment just because it was published in X journal. So I think that sort of taking back that agency again of like, you are a capable scientist and you can judge the work that you're reading. And with the help of the community that might help you get to the bits that are not your immediate area of expertise, I think we should sort of take that critical look at science and sort of approach them that way. Like, you shouldn't come with the mindset like, oh, since this is a preprint, it's probably crap. I think that's the wrong mindset, because as Richard said, 70% of these things will eventually get published. So what's the difference? The difference is just you're reading it earlier. And I cut off someone. I don't know if it was Rosé who wants us to hang up.
No, if you
no,
have
it wasn't
one,
me.
go
It
ahead.
wasn't me.
Oh, okay. And I'm happy to keep answering some more questions. I think we covered most of the issues that were brought up beforehand. I was happy to see that there were a lot of PhD students who were very curious about this. I think it's great to get the sort of younger generations of scientists adopting preprints, because they're the PIs of the future. So the sooner in the career that this becomes normalized, I think, the better for the future. So.
And yeah, and I think you should really have to emphasize this point about how much it can potentially benefit the younger people, because you have, I mean, there's lots of instances where you may be on a postdoctoral fellowship for 2 or 3 years, and if you submit your paper and it takes 2 years to get into Cell, those timelines are incompatible. So you have situations where people are literally treading water at the end of the postdoc, and the only reason they're still there, and they might run out of money or whatever, is because they're waiting for the paper because that will get them a job. And so what's really interesting now is seeing these examples. I gave the example of Rockefeller saying, we want you to put preprints in your job applications because we want to see your recent work, not the work you did 2 years ago. And there's one of the, I didn't talk about it, but I showed on one of the slides, there was the example of Nikolai Slavov, who's actually now a bioRxiv affiliate, but he's a tenured scientist at Northeastern, I think, and he got his job because of a paper he had on bioRxiv, and then he got the job, and by the time he was in the job, then the paper came out in Cell. So I think for young scientists, that's just to reiterate that point, it's really useful for them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and thank you for the time. I think definitely the system is evolving. Things are changing. This is the case for, as Richard mentioned about the life reviewing system. Probably the next step is that funding agencies start considering more and more the work published in preprints. Definitely that could help to everyone engaging in using the system. But I think it's been a great talk. Thank you so much. We appreciate it, and thanks. And then best for you in your work, in your research, and thanks for doing this job, because I think you are doing a job for all the community. So it's really important. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I wish I could be there and see you all again. I
hopefully soon.
really enjoyed my time at the Institute. So I would love to visit. Maybe a year from now, we could do this again in person.
Great.
Now I see that there are 2 people with the hands up. That maybe you can address directly to. You can send an email to Olaya, maybe.
Yeah, I dropped.
If that's okay.
I dropped my email in the chat, and I'll be happy to follow up with any of you. Richard is the Twitter representative, so if Twitter is your thing, then Richard is your person. Okay, well, thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you.
Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.